Hello, beautiful souls. Welcome to this quiet space, a place where minds slow down and hearts rest. Before we begin this gentle, sleepy journey, just a small moment of support. If this meditation brings you calm, comfort, or clarity, please subscribe to the channel, gently tap the like button, and leave a comment to let us know you are here. Your support helps us continue creating these peaceful spaces for your mind, for your heart. Now, there is nothing else you need to do, nothing to think about. Let's begin. Close your eyes now and slowly settle into a comfortable position. Take a gentle breath in and slowly breathe out. Let your shoulders relax, let your jaw loosen, and allow your whole body to feel heavy. Close your eyes for a moment, or perhaps leave them open, softly, gently, and let the words carry you somewhere quiet. Imagine the earliest light of morning. Not the bright, urgent light of midday, but the first soft suggestion of it, a pale gray dissolving at the horizon, blushing slowly into rose, then gold. The air is cool. It carries moisture on it, a faint mineral sweetness, the smell of earth that has been breathing all night in the dark. You are standing at the edge of a forest. The trees are tall here, very tall, and between them, a mist drifts in long, slow ribbons, unhurried, as though it has nowhere it needs to be. The forest floor is soft beneath your feet. Layers of old leaves, crumbled and composted across years, lie in deep quiet cushions. Moss covers the roots of old trees in thick green velvet. Tiny ferns uncurl their pale new fronds in the growing light, patient as held breath. And then, the first ray of sunlight finds a gap between the canopy leaves above. It falls in a long, slanted column through the mist, illuminating 100,000 drifting particles, spores, dust, the exhalations of the forest itself. It touches a single leaf on a low-growing plant near your feet. And in that instant, something begins. Something so ancient, so quiet, so continuous that it happens whether anyone watches or not. The leaf warms slightly. Tiny pores on its surface begin to open. Chemistry stirs in microscopic chambers within the leaf's tissue. And the plant begins, as it always does, as it has always done, to work. Now pull back. Let your perspective rise slowly, like a camera lifting on a long cable through the canopy and into open sky. The forest stretches beneath you, enormous and green, spreading across hills and valleys in every direction. Rivers thread through it, silver in the early light. The mist lies in the low places. Birdsong rises from somewhere in the trees. Keep rising. The continent reveals itself. The forest gives way to grasslands, golden, swaying gently in a wind you can no longer feel from this height. Then to scrubland, dry and gray-green, dotted with the round silhouettes of desert shrubs. Then to high mountain slopes where trees grow shorter and shorter as elevation increases, until they stop altogether and only low cushion plants cling to the rock. Then to the treeless tundra, where the ground is barely unfrozen for a few weeks each year, and yet small, stubborn plants push their flowers up toward the brief Arctic sun. Every surface, every climate, every altitude, wherever there is light and a little moisture, and even a thin layer of soil, there are plants. They cover the continents in a living mosaic that has taken hundreds of millions of years to assemble. They grow in the cracks of city pavements, in the shallows of desert oases, on the windswept faces of oceanic cliffs, in the permanent humidity of tropical rainforests where the air is so thick with water that the leaves drip constantly. They grow underwater, and they grow in salt marshes where the soil is toxic to most life, and they grow on the slopes of volcanoes in the thin, ashy soil left behind by eruption. But come back down before you go too far. Return to the forest floor. Kneel here, in the moss, where the light is soft and filtered. Press your fingers gently into the soil. Feel its texture, not the sandy dryness of a path, but the rich, crumbling dampness of healthy forest earth, full of particles of different sizes, threaded through with fibers and root hairs barely thicker than a strand of spiderweb. This soil did not exist before plants. It is, in a meaningful sense, made of them, made of the slow accumulation of decomposed plant material across centuries, each leaf that fell in autumn contributing its carbon, each root that died in winter adding its minerals back to the medium. The soil beneath a mature forest is itself a record of plant evolution, a physical archive of organic processes carried out across time so long it exceeds our ordinary sense of history. Look up from here. Through the layered canopy above you, the low ferns, the understory shrubs, the mid-canopy trees with their broad leaves reaching for every gap in the light, the tall canopy trees pushing their crowns into full sun, you can see the entire logic of a forest. Each layer occupying a different stratum of light. Each species finding its place not by negotiation or planning, but by the slow sifting of selection across generations, each lineage persisting where it can survive and not where it cannot. The forest, seen from here, is a vertical landscape of light and shade and solution, every plant a different answer to the same fundamental question: how do I get enough light, enough water, enough nutrients, to grow and reproduce before I die? Stand up slowly. Notice how quiet it is. Not silent, there are birds, and the faint rustle of a breeze high in the canopy, and somewhere the soft sound of water over stones, but quiet in a deeper sense. The forest is not in any hurry. It has been doing exactly what it is doing now for a very long time, and it will continue doing it long after this particular morning has passed. And now, as you look down at all of this green, at this vast, quiet, unbroken presence of plant life across the surface of the earth, a question settles gently into the mind. How? How have they done this? These living things that cannot run from danger, that cannot search for water when the ground is dry, that cannot move toward light when shade falls over them, that cannot reach for food when nutrients are scarce, that have no muscles, no eyes, no nervous system, no brain, and yet have managed not only to survive, but to colonize an entire planet, to transform its atmosphere, to shape its climate, to create the very conditions that allow almost every other form of life to exist. How does a thing that cannot move become the most successful form of life on land? The answer is not fast. It has never been fast. The answer is evolution, slow, patient, cumulative evolution, working across timescales so enormous they are almost impossible to feel. Thousands of years, hundreds of thousands, millions. The kind of time in which a mountain can rise, and erode, and rise again. The kind of time in which the continents drift apart and ocean basins close. The kind of time in which a small change in a single gene, barely perceptible in any individual plant, becomes the defining trait of an entire species. Plants are not miraculous. They are not magical. But they are extraordinary, deeply, quietly extraordinary in the way that all things shaped by deep time tend to be. They are the product of an ongoing conversation between life and environment, a conversation carried on not in words, but in the slow language of inheritance and change and selection. And that conversation is still happening. Right now. Invisibly. In the forest you just imagined at dawn, in every leaf and root and stem and seed, the process continues. Plants are still evolving. They have never stopped. This is a story about that process, about what plants are, and how they came to be this way, and what the long, patient arc of their evolution reveals about survival itself. It is a long story. The longest, perhaps, that has ever been told. And so, as the forest settles into its morning quiet, and the mist lifts slowly from the valleys, we begin. Before there were forests, before there were grasslands or deserts or mountain meadows, before any plant grew anywhere on the dry surface of the earth, there was the ocean. For most of the history of life on this planet, the ocean was where life lived. Only in the ocean. The land was bare, a vast, inhospitable expanse of naked rock and dust and occasional volcanic activity, swept by ultraviolet radiation from a sun unfiltered by ozone, scoured by wind, frozen by night, baked by day. If you had stood on the shoreline of the early Earth, perhaps 500 million years ago or more, the interior of the continents would have looked almost entirely lifeless. A landscape of stone, austere, without green. But in the shallow coastal waters, things were different. In the sunlit margins of the ancient ocean, life had already been elaborating itself for billions of years. Simple single-celled organisms had learned to photosynthesize, to capture the energy of sunlight and use it to build sugars from carbon dioxide and water. These early photosynthesizers, the cyanobacteria and their descendants, had already transformed the planet profoundly over deep time, releasing oxygen as a byproduct of their chemistry until the atmosphere itself changed composition. The air became breathable, not for anything that existed yet, but as a kind of slow preparation for what would come. Among these ancient ocean dwellers were the green algae. Floating near the surface in the warm, nutrient-rich shallows, drifting in mats near the coast, anchoring themselves to shallow rocks, these organisms were photosynthetic, sun-powered, water-dependent, content in their medium. They had been successful in the ocean for a very long time. In many ways, they still are. If you have ever seen the green scum on a still pond, or the bright green algae coating a rocky tidal pool, you are seeing cousins of these ancient creatures, largely unchanged in their basic design across hundreds of millions of years. But some of those ancient algae, some branch of that green lineage, made a transition that would change the planet more completely than perhaps any other evolutionary event in the history of life. They moved toward land. This was not intentional. Nothing in evolution is intentional. There was no desire, no plan, no decision. What likely happened was gradual. Perhaps certain algae began colonizing zones that were intermittently exposed, tidal flats, rocky shores that dried out between tides, the dampness at the base of coastal cliffs. These environments were harsh in ways the open ocean was not. But they also offered something valuable: light. Unfiltered, abundant light, without the competition for it that came from living alongside millions of other photosynthetic organisms in the water. And so, slowly, incrementally, across thousands and thousands of generations, certain algae lineages began to acquire features that allowed them to survive brief exposure to air, then longer exposure, then permanent life out of water. Each of the challenges this required solving was immense. In the ocean, buoyancy takes care of structure. Water holds a plant up. Its weight is distributed through the medium it lives in. On land, gravity becomes a problem to solve. Without water to support their weight, the earliest land plants needed some kind of structural rigidity, some way to hold themselves upright, or at least to hold their photosynthetic surfaces toward the light without collapsing under their own mass. Then there was desiccation, the constant threat of drying out. In the ocean, water surrounds the organism at all times. On land, it evaporates from every surface. Early land plants needed a way to slow that evaporation, to hold water inside themselves against the constant pull of dry air. There was also the challenge of ultraviolet radiation. In deep water, UV rays are absorbed before they can cause much damage. On land, especially before the ozone layer had fully developed, UV radiation was intense and damaging to the delicate chemistry of photosynthesis. And there was the problem of obtaining nutrients. In the ocean, dissolved minerals drift freely in the water. On land, those nutrients are locked in soil, a medium that didn't even exist yet in the way we know it, since soil formation itself depends heavily on the activity of plants. The solutions to these problems, evolved over millions of years, are still visible in every plant alive today. The waxy cuticle was one of the earliest innovations. This is a thin layer of a waxy substance called cutin, secreted by the outermost cells of the plant's surface, forming a nearly waterproof coating over leaves and stems. You can feel it on many plants today: the glossy surface of a magnolia leaf, the smooth waxy skin of a succulent. It is the plant's barrier between itself and a drying world, sealing moisture inside while allowing gas exchange through tiny, controllable pores called stomata. Stomata themselves were another innovation, small openings in the leaf surface, flanked by specialized cells called guard cells that can open and close the pore like a tiny valve. When the plant needs to exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen with the atmosphere, the stomata open. When conditions are dry and water loss must be minimized, they close. It is an elegant, finely tuned mechanism that plants evolved hundreds of millions of years ago and that remains fundamentally unchanged to this day. To solve the problem of standing upright, plants evolved structural molecules, most notably lignin, a complex compound that stiffens cell walls and makes them rigid. Lignin is one of the most abundant organic polymers on Earth. It is what makes wood hard. It is the reason a tree trunk can support tons of weight. It is also remarkably resistant to decomposition, which is why ancient forests, buried and compressed over millions of years, became the coal we now mine from the ground. And to solve the problem of moving water and nutrients from one part of the plant to another, from roots to leaves, from leaves downward to growing tissues, plants evolved the vascular system. Two types of tissue, xylem and phloem, became the plant's internal circulatory network. Xylem carries water and dissolved minerals upward from roots to the rest of the plant, through a process driven partly by the evaporation of water from leaf surfaces, which creates a kind of continuous suction through tubes of cells. Phloem carries the sugars produced by photosynthesis downward and outward to wherever the plant needs them, growing tips, roots, seeds. Think of them, if you like, as two separate pipe systems running in parallel through the plant's body. One carries raw materials up. The other distributes finished products out. Together, they made complex, large, multi-storied plant bodies possible. With these adaptations accumulating gradually over millions of years, the land began to green. It was slow, tentative. The earliest land plants were low and small, mat-like, creeping, hugging the moist margins of water bodies. But they were there. And as they spread, they began to change the land itself, their roots helping to break down rock into the first soils, their bodies adding organic matter, creating habitats, altering the chemistry of the ground and the atmosphere. By around 350 million years ago, something extraordinary had happened. The continents were covered in forests. Vast, ancient forests of strange, tree-like plants, some related to modern ferns and horsetails but enormously large, some with bark and wood unlike anything alive today. The air in these forests would have been different from what we breathe now, richer in oxygen, the product of all that photosynthesis. Insects grew enormous in that oxygen-rich atmosphere. Amphibians were conquering the land. And the planet was, in its surface appearance, transformed beyond anything that had existed before. The greening of the continents had begun. And it would never really stop. To understand how plants became what they are, it helps to understand the process that made them, the process that makes all living things what they are, and to understand it not as a complicated theory, but as something almost intuitive, almost simple, once you hold it gently in the mind. Evolution, at its core, is just this: things change, and those changes sometimes help. That is the beginning of it. The rest is elaboration. Every living organism carries within its cells a set of instructions for building itself, a kind of molecular blueprint encoded in long strands of a molecule called DNA. These instructions are copied every time a cell divides, every time a parent organism produces offspring. The copying is extraordinarily precise. The machinery that replicates DNA makes very few errors. But it is not perfect. Now and then, by chance, a tiny mistake creeps in, a single chemical letter out of billions transcribed incorrectly. A mutation. Most mutations are neutral. They change something in the blueprint that doesn't actually affect the organism's functioning in any meaningful way. A few are harmful. They disrupt something important, make the organism less functional. And occasionally, rarely, a mutation turns out to be beneficial. It changes something in a way that, in the particular conditions that organism lives in, helps it survive a little better, or reproduce a little more successfully. Those beneficial mutations are the raw material of evolution. Here's the key thing about evolution that is easy to miss when you first encounter it: it has no plan. It has no direction, no destination, no intention. It does not try to make organisms better in some absolute sense. It simply selects, mechanically and without judgment, for whatever happens to work in the current environment. The environment is the filter. Whatever survives to reproduce, reproduces. Whatever doesn't, doesn't. Generation after generation, over deep time, this filter slowly shapes the population. Think of it as a conversation. The environment asks, continuously and without pause, what works here? And life answers, through its survival and reproduction, through the traits it passes on and the traits it fails to pass on. The conversation has been going on for approximately 3.8 billion years. And in that time, life has found answers to an extraordinary range of questions posed by an extraordinary range of environments. In plants, you can see the results of this conversation everywhere, if you know how to look. Consider the thickness of a leaf. In a moist, temperate climate, where water is abundant, leaves can afford to be large and thin, maximizing the surface area available for capturing light, because light, not water, is the limiting resource. But in a dry climate, large thin leaves lose too much water through evaporation. In those environments, over many generations, plants with thicker leaves, smaller leaves, or leaves with reduced surface area tended to survive better. Their offspring inherited that thickness. The populations gradually shifted toward compactness, toward conservation, toward drought tolerance. No individual plant decided to have thicker leaves. No plant tried to adapt. What happened was simpler and more mechanical, In any generation, some plants happen to have slightly thicker leaves than others, because of small genetic differences. In a dry environment, those plants lost less water, survived longer, reproduced more. Their offspring were more numerous. And those offspring tended to also have relatively thick leaves, because the trait was inherited. Over thousands of generations, the average leaf thickness in the population shifted upward. The thick-leaved plants had no advantage they were aware of. The environment simply selected for them. This is how all plant adaptations work, at their foundation. Not by design, but by differential survival. Not by intention, but by the relentless arithmetic of reproduction. Genetic variation, the diversity of traits within a population, is crucial to this process. If every plant in a population were genetically identical, there would be nothing for selection to work with. Variation is what gives evolution material to shape. It comes from mutations, but also from the shuffling of existing genes that happens during sexual reproduction, flowers, pollen, seeds, the mixing of genetic instructions from two parents into something new. Environmental pressure is what drives the direction of selection. A sudden drought, a new insect herbivore arriving in a landscape, a shift in temperature, a change in the chemistry of the soil, each of these creates a new filter. Each one asks the population a new question, and over time, the population answers. And then there is time. The ingredient without which none of this is possible. Time so deep and so vast that it is difficult to really feel. 1,000 years seems long to a human. But 1,000 years is nothing in evolutionary terms, perhaps 40 or 50 plant generations, depending on the species. Meaningful change in a population typically requires tens of thousands of generations, sometimes millions. Which means, for a long-lived tree species that reproduces every decade, we might need millions of years to observe significant evolutionary change. This is why evolution feels invisible to us. It moves at a pace entirely outside our intuitive sense of time. We can observe small adaptations, changes in flower color, shifts in the timing of germination, slight variations in root architecture across different climate zones, but the grand transformations, the emergence of entirely new body plans and physiological systems, happen across scales of time that no individual ever witnesses. And yet, they happen. The evidence is everywhere, in every living plant. In the waxy cuticle inherited from the earliest land plants. In the vascular tissue that still moves water by the same principle it always has. In the flowers that evolved relatively recently, in geological terms, and yet now dominate most of the world's plant communities. Every adaptation, every feature, is a record of a past conversation between plant and environment, a problem posed and answered across deep time. It is perhaps the most patient process in the universe. And plants, it turns out, are among its quietest and most eloquent products. Go underground now. Let the light fade. Imagine the soil not as a solid barrier, but as a world, a dense, dark, endlessly complex world of particles and pores and moisture and life. Grain by grain, the mineral particles of broken rock sit interspersed with fragments of organic matter, the decomposed remains of organisms that lived and died across centuries. Between the particles, air pockets, thin films of water, and threading through all of it, in every direction, roots. The roots of a single mature tree can extend outward much further than the canopy above, reaching, in some species, to 3 or 4 times the diameter of the crown. They descend through layers of soil with different textures, different moisture levels, different chemical compositions. The fine root tips, barely visible to the naked eye, explore the soil continuously, growing, branching, dying, being replaced. A single mature plant can have kilometers of roots, if you were somehow to untangle and stretch them end to end. A vast, three-dimensional network operating entirely in the dark. Roots have several functions, all of them essential. They anchor the plant, driving down and spreading outward to hold the above-ground body stable against wind and gravity. They absorb water from the soil, drawing it up through their tissues and into the vascular system. And they absorb dissolved mineral nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and dozens of other elements in trace amounts that the plant needs for building its tissues and running its biochemistry. But how does a root know where to grow? This is one of the quieter wonders of plant biology. Root tips sense their environment. They respond to gravity, always growing downward in response to the Earth's pull, through a mechanism involving specialized cells that contain dense starch granules which settle downward under gravity, signaling the direction of down to the growing tip. This is called gravitropism, and it ensures that roots grow into the soil and not out of it. Roots also respond to moisture gradients, growing toward wetter areas of soil in a process called hydrotropism. They respond to physical obstacles, adjusting their direction of growth to navigate around rocks. They even respond to chemical signals. Specific nutrient ions in the soil can attract root growth toward them. None of this requires a brain. It is all chemistry and physics, operating through gene expression and cell signaling at the level of individual root tip cells. And yet the result is a root system that behaves, over time, as though it is searching, intelligently, adaptively, purposefully, for what the plant needs. The evolution of roots was one of the most significant events in the history of plant life on land. Before roots, the earliest land plants could only obtain water and nutrients from the thin layer of material at the surface, where they directly contacted soil. Roots allowed plants to reach deeper, to tap reserves of water buried below the dry surface, to access nutrient-rich layers at different depths, to grow in places where surface conditions were unfavorable but subsurface conditions were more hospitable. Different environments shaped different root architectures. In deep, loose soils with fluctuating water tables, long taproot systems evolved, a dominant central root that drives straight down, reaching toward reliable moisture at depth. Desert plants often have impressive taproots. The mesquite tree of the American Southwest, for example, can send a taproot down more than 15 meters into the ground, reaching water that never evaporates from the surface. At the other extreme, plants in waterlogged soils, where deep roots would be smothered in oxygen-poor mud, often evolved shallow spreading root systems, wide, close to the surface, to maximize oxygen access and avoid the anaerobic depths. But roots do not work alone. Beneath the soil surface, there is a partnership that is perhaps the most important symbiosis in the history of terrestrial life. Between the roots of most land plants and a group of fungi called mycorrhizal fungi, there exists a relationship of mutual support that has been maintained, remarkably, for over 400 million years, since very nearly the beginning of plant life on land. The mycorrhizal fungi grow in and around the cells of plant roots. Their own filaments, called hyphae, extend out into the surrounding soil in a fine network far more extensive than the roots themselves, because fungal hyphae are far thinner than root cells, and can penetrate spaces that roots cannot enter, accessing pockets of nutrients that the plant alone could never reach. The fungi extract mineral nutrients from these spaces, particularly phosphorus, which is essential for plant growth but often locked in forms that plant roots cannot easily absorb, and transfer them into the plant's root cells. In exchange, the plant provides the fungi with sugars, the products of photosynthesis, the fixed carbon that the fungi, living in darkness, cannot produce themselves. It is a trade, carbon for minerals, energy for access. A partnership forged in deep time and maintained by the mutual dependency of two very different kinds of life. And it extends further still. The fungal networks do not connect just one plant to the soil. They connect many plants together. The hyphae of a single fungal individual can extend across meters, or even hundreds of meters, of forest floor, connecting the root systems of dozens or hundreds of trees. Through these connections, carbon-rich signals, water, and certain nutrients can move between connected plants. A large, established tree with access to abundant sunlight may, through the fungal network, transfer some of its photosynthate, its surplus sugars, to a smaller seedling growing in shade, one that does not yet have enough light to fully support itself. This phenomenon has been described, somewhat poetically, as the Wood Wide Web. And like all poetry, it captures something true while also simplifying. The network is not a communication system in the way we usually mean that word. There are no messages, no intentional signals being sent between trees. But there is a transfer of resources, mediated by chemistry and the passive flow of gradients, that connects the fates of plants that appear to be growing independently. A forest is not a collection of separate organisms competing in isolation. It is, to a significant degree, a community, physiologically interconnected in ways that the above-ground world, with its visible separateness of individual tree trunks and canopy crowns, does not reveal. Half of the plant's life, perhaps more, is invisible, hidden underground, in the dark and the quiet. And often, it is in this hidden half that the most crucial struggles are won: the searches for water, the capture of phosphorus, the quiet establishment of the connections that sustain the whole. There is something worth sitting within that idea. The visible plant, the leaves and flowers and stems that we see and photograph and admire, is, in a very real sense, the surface presentation of something much larger happening below. What rises into the air is supported, supplied, and sustained by what grows in the dark. And the dark is far more active than it appears. A handful of healthy forest soil contains billions of bacteria, millions of fungal cells, thousands of tiny invertebrates, and the root tips of dozens of plant species, all in a constant chemical conversation, releasing signals, absorbing nutrients, excreting compounds that alter the soil chemistry for the organisms around them. What looks, from above, like inert earth, is, at its own scale, as complex and dynamic as any coral reef or tropical canopy. The root tip itself, that pale, barely visible growing point at the end of each fine root, is one of the most quietly remarkable structures in the living world. It is protected by a cap of cells called the root cap, which produces a lubricating mucilage that eases the root's passage through soil particles, and which contains those gravity-sensing cells that orient the root's direction of growth. Just behind the root cap, a zone of actively dividing cells, the meristem, generates new cells that push the root tip forward, millimeter by millimeter, through the soil. The whole process is so slow it is invisible to direct observation. And yet, accumulated across the entire root system of a large tree, across a full growing season, thousands of meters of new root tissue are produced. The underground growth of a mature tree in a single summer, if measured in total root length added, would astonish almost anyone who tried to calculate it. Survival happens where no one looks. Come back up now, into the light. Let the soil fall away beneath you, and rise through the root zone, up through the stem, out into the open air. Here is a leaf. Hold it lightly in your attention. Most leaves are green, though the shade of green varies enormously, from the deep, saturated bottle green of a forest understory, to the pale, almost yellow green of new growth in spring, to the blue green of many succulent leaves, to the gray green of desert sage. The color is the first clue to what is happening inside. Within every green cell of a leaf, there are small structures called chloroplasts. These are the sites of photosynthesis, the ancient process by which plants capture energy from sunlight and use it to build the carbon compounds that fuel their lives and ultimately, ours. Chloroplasts contain a pigment called chlorophyll, which absorbs light most strongly in the red and blue parts of the spectrum, and reflects green, which is why we see plants as green. In a sense, green is the color that plants throw away. It is the light they do not use. The process of photosynthesis, described simply, goes like this. Sunlight strikes the chlorophyll molecules in a chloroplast. The energy of that light energizes certain electrons, setting off a chain of chemical reactions. Carbon dioxide, drawn in from the air through the stomata, is combined with water, drawn up from the roots, and reorganized into sugar molecules, glucose and its relatives, using the energy from that light. Oxygen is released as a byproduct, exhaled through the stomata into the air. In this way, a leaf is a factory. It takes raw materials, light, carbon dioxide, water, and produces a product, sugar. The sugar is the fuel and the building material for everything the plant does. It is respired in the plant cells to release energy for growth, for reproduction, for all the active chemistry of life. It is converted into other molecules, cellulose for cell walls, lignin for structural support, proteins for enzymes, fats for membranes, a vast array of secondary compounds for defense, communication, and attraction. And the oxygen. The oxygen that is released as a byproduct of photosynthesis, that is the oxygen in the atmosphere that every animal on Earth, including every human being who has ever lived, breathes. The air that fills your lungs right now is, in this sense, a product of photosynthesis. The breath you are breathing is composed partly of molecules released by leaves. But photosynthesis is not equally easy in every environment. Light varies. Water varies. Temperature varies. And the leaf, the organ of photosynthesis, has evolved an extraordinary diversity of forms and features in response to these variations. In tropical rainforests, where light is often the limiting resource, filtered through multiple layers of canopy before it reaches the forest floor, leaves tend to be broad and flat, maximizing the surface area that can intercept what light is available. They are often large, sometimes dramatically so. The leaf of the giant water lily can be 2 meters across. Monstera leaves develop holes and splits that allow wind to pass through without tearing the leaf, but also, some researchers believe, allow patches of light filtering down through the canopy to reach lower leaves that would otherwise be shaded. In the deep understory of a dense forest, even fractional improvements in light capture matter. In deserts, the calculation is reversed. Water is scarce, and leaves lose water through their stomata every time those pores open to take in carbon dioxide. The cost of photosynthesis, in water terms, can be unsustainably high. Desert plants have evolved leaves that reduce this cost. Many have small leaves, reducing the total surface area through which water is lost. Some have leaves covered in fine hairs. A layer of still air trapped among the hairs reduces the rate of water evaporation from the surface. Some have evolved highly reflective surfaces, bouncing excess light away to prevent the leaf from overheating. And some have given up on broad, flat leaves entirely, replacing them with spines or scales, and moved photosynthesis into green stems. In cold climates, mountain slopes, boreal forests, Arctic tundra, leaves face a different challenge: long winters when photosynthesis is impossible, and the metabolic cost of maintaining broad leaves through freeze-thaw cycles is prohibitive. Deciduous trees solve this by shedding their leaves each autumn, a graceful sacrifice, a letting go, and growing new ones each spring from buds that waited dormant through the cold. Coniferous trees take a different approach. Their leaves are needles, thin, narrow, covered in a thick waxy cuticle, with sunken stomata protected from drying winter winds, and a chemistry that resists freezing. These needle leaves are expensive to produce, but long-lived, persisting for several years before being shed, amortizing the investment over many seasons. Then there are the more specialized photosynthetic strategies that have evolved independently in different plant lineages. Most plants use what is called C3 photosynthesis, the original, ancestral form of the process, in which carbon dioxide is fixed into 3 carbon molecules. It is effective, but has a limitation. At high temperatures and in bright light, an enzyme called rubus-CO sometimes accidentally grabs oxygen instead of carbon dioxide, triggering a wasteful side reaction called photorespiration that undoes some of the work of photosynthesis. Some plants, evolving in hot, sunny environments, developed a workaround called C4 photosynthesis. In C4 plants, which include corn, sugarcane, and many grasses, a 2-stage process concentrates carbon dioxide in specific cells around the photosynthetic tissue, essentially creating a high CO2 environment that suppresses photorespiration even at high temperatures. C4 photosynthesis is more efficient in hot, dry, high-light conditions, which is why many of the world's most productive crops and the grasses of tropical savannas use it. And then there is CEM photosynthesis, used by cacti, succulents, and many other desert plants. Chem plants open their stomata at night, when temperatures are cooler and water loss through evaporation is much reduced, taking in carbon dioxide and storing it in chemical form. During the day, when the sun is bright but the stomata are closed, the stored carbon dioxide is released internally and used for photosynthesis. It is a remarkable temporal juggling act, splitting a process that normally happens simultaneously into 2 separate phases, one at night, one during the day, to preserve water while still capturing energy. Each of these strategies is an answer to the same question, posed by a different environment. How do you capture enough light and carbon to live, while losing as little water as possible? The diversity of leaves, in shape, size, surface texture, color, internal architecture, is the visible record of all the different answers that evolution has found. Every leaf catching sunlight this morning is a solution that took millions of years to refine. Somewhere far from the forest, the landscape changes. The trees thin, and then disappear. The soil becomes paler, sandier, stonier. The air is dry, genuinely, profoundly dry, so dry that it seems to pull moisture from your skin the moment you step into it. The sky is enormous, and blue, and cloudless. And the sun presses down on a landscape that appears, at first glance, to be nearly empty. But look more carefully. There, between 2 pale rocks, a small succulent grows, round, fat, ridged, holding its blue-green body close to the ground. There, a cactus stands in elegant vertical columns, its surface pleated like an accordion, dotted with clusters of pale spines. There, a low-grade bush spreads its small, stiff, silver-haired leaves above the dry ground, roots reaching invisibly down through the sand. This is the desert. And it is full of life, of a kind that has learned, through long evolutionary time, exactly what it takes to survive here. Drought is one of the oldest and most persistent environmental pressures that plants have ever faced. The earliest land plants immediately encountered the challenge of desiccation. Life out of water is life constantly at risk of drying out, and the entire history of plant evolution on land is, in part, a history of progressively more sophisticated solutions to the water problem. In deserts, that problem is simply at its most extreme. The first and most obvious adaptation is storage. Many desert plants, the cacti, the aloes, The agaves, the ice plants and stone crops, have evolved the ability to store large quantities of water within specialized cells in their leaves, or stems, or roots. These storage cells are swollen and watery, sometimes almost spongy in texture, packed with mucilaginous compounds that help hold water even as the external environment becomes desperately dry. This is the succulent strategy: fill up when water is available, and live off the reserves when it is not. Cacti take this to an extraordinary degree. Their stems are the primary organs of both photosynthesis and water storage. Their leaves have been reduced entirely to spines, which serve a different purpose. The accordion-like ridges and flutes that run along a cactus stem are not decorative. They are engineering. When the cactus absorbs water after rain, those ridges allow the stem to expand without splitting, like a pleated paper cup. When the cactus draws on its stored water during drought, the stem contracts along those same ridges. The entire body of the plant is designed as a water tank, built to fill, and built to drain slowly, over months of dry weather. The spines of cacti are modified leaves. They serve several purposes simultaneously. They reduce water loss by eliminating the broad, thin photosynthetic surface that would evaporate too much moisture in desert conditions. They protect the plant from herbivores. The succulent, water-filled body of a cactus would be an irresistible water source to a thirsty animal in a dry landscape, without some deterrent. And they shade the stem surface, reducing the heating and evaporation that would otherwise occur under full desert sun. In some species, spines also condense dew from nighttime air, allowing tiny droplets of water to run down to the base of the plant, a small but real water harvest from an apparently waterless sky. Roots in desert plants have evolved in two contrasting directions, both effective. Some species have very deep taproots, driving down through the dry surface layers to reach permanent water sources far below, underground aquifers, moisture trapped in deep rock fractures. The Palo Verde tree and various desert willows take this approach. Others spread their roots extremely wide but very shallow, just below the surface, covering enormous areas of ground to capture as much rain as possible the moment it falls, before it evaporates or drains away. The saguaro cactus does this. Its roots can extend outward as far as the plant is tall, just below the surface, poised to absorb even a light shower. Some desert plants take a completely different approach: avoidance. Instead of adapting to endure drought, they avoid it by timing their lives around it. Annual desert plants, the wildflowers that seem to appear from nowhere after rain, have no special drought tolerance in their vegetative tissues at all. Their strategy is to exist as seeds during the dry months, dormant, tough, and nearly indestructible. And to germinate, grow, flower, and set seed with remarkable speed during and after rain events. Their whole life cycle, from seed to seed, might last only a few weeks. They do not survive drought by enduring it. They survive it by being absent for it, compressed into the incredible resilience of a seed. Seed dormancy in desert plants is often finely tuned. Some species will not germinate unless they receive a minimum amount of rainfall. A chemical in the seed coat must be washed away by a sufficient quantity of water before germination can proceed. This prevents the plant from germinating in response to a light shower that might then dry up before the seedling can establish itself. The seed, in a sense, measures the rain and makes a calculated response. Other desert adaptations involve the timing of physiological activity. Many desert perennials slow or stop their metabolic activity during the driest periods, a state of reduced function, though not quite the deep dormancy of a winter-adapted plant, then resume normal activity when conditions improve. Some lose their leaves during drought, and replace them when rains return. And there is the patient resilience of the seeds themselves. desert seeds can remain viable, capable of germination, for years, sometimes decades. Scientists have germinated seeds found in ancient desert caches that were hundreds of years old. The famous case of date palm seeds found at Masada in Israel, approximately 2,000 years old, produced a viable seedling after careful germination trials. The seed, patient and sealed against time, waited. Evolution under extreme stress has a particular quality to it. It is not the gradual, many-directional exploration of more benign environments, where multiple strategies can coexist and slowly improve. It is a sharper, more constrained process. The environment is an uncompromising filter, and only the most precisely fitted survive. The result is the extraordinary specificity of desert adaptations, organisms that work only in these conditions, that have been shaped so exactly to their harsh world, that they cannot exist in milder ones without losing the very features that make them what they are. Patience and precision. The two qualities the desert requires. And the plants that live there have them in abundance. At the other extreme, go north, or high, to a mountain meadow at Treeline, where the last stunted spruces cling to the rocky slope, their crowns pressed flat and horizontal by years of wind-loading snow. Above them, the trees stop. The air is thinner, the growing season shorter, the winters longer and colder than anything the forest below experiences. And yet, there are plants here. They grow close to the ground, very close, as though pressing themselves into the earth for warmth. Cushion plants, they are called, for their shape. Dense, rounded mounds of tightly packed small stems and leaves, forming compact hemispheres that might be mistaken for mosses at first glance, but are in fact flowering plants, saxifrages, moss campions, phlox. Flowering and setting seed in the brief summer window before cold returns. The cushion form is not an accident of aesthetics. It is engineering. A dense, low-growing mound creates a microclimate within itself. The temperature inside the cushion can be several degrees warmer than the air around it, simply because the still air trapped among the tightly packed stems is not blown away by wind, and the dark surface absorbs solar radiation and holds it. On a sunny alpine day, the interior of a cushion plant can feel warm to the touch. The plant has built its own miniature greenhouse, a private thermal refuge in a cold and restless world. Cold is one of the most physically challenging environments for any organism, because cold causes water to freeze. And water that freezes inside cells expands, forming ice crystals that can pierce and rupture delicate membranes. Damage that is often fatal. Living in cold climates requires solutions to this fundamental physical problem. Some plants avoid the worst cold through timing. They complete their entire life cycle in the brief warm months, then die back to underground roots, bulbs, or seeds, before winter comes. Alpine annuals burst into productivity in summer, then vanish, existing as potential beneath the snow. Others tolerate freezing through biochemical adaptation. They alter the composition of their cell membranes so that they remain flexible at low temperatures. They accumulate sugars and other solutes inside their cells, substances that lower the freezing point of the internal fluid, functioning much like antifreeze. Some even produce specialized proteins that interfere with ice crystal formation, guiding ice to form between cells rather than inside them. Managing the inevitable, instead of trying to prevent it entirely. Deciduous trees display one of the most intricate cold adaptations of all, and one of the most visually spectacular. As days shorten and temperatures drop in autumn, these trees begin a carefully orchestrated withdrawal. Chlorophyll, the green pigment of summer, is broken down and reabsorbed into the branches and trunk. valuable nitrogen and other nutrients are reclaimed. As the green fades, pigments that were present all along, carotenoids, are revealed, glowing yellow and orange. In some species, new pigments are made as the old ones disappear. Anthocyanins, producing the deep reds and purples of autumn forests. Why invest energy in producing pigment in a leaf that is about to fall? Perhaps to shield vulnerable tissues from bright autumn sunlight during nutrient recovery. Perhaps to signal to insects that this tree is strong and chemically defended. Even in letting go, the tree is strategic. The falling of leaves, abscission, is not passive loss. A special separation layer forms at the base of each leaf stem. Cells weaken in a precise band. The connection is severed cleanly, and the wound is sealed before the leaf drops. The tree does not lose its leaves like cargo torn away in a storm. It releases them deliberately. Beneath the snow, life does not entirely stop. Snow, paradoxically, protects. A thick snowpack insulates the soil, keeping it near freezing rather than exposing it to the far colder air above. Roots continue their slow metabolic processes in the dark. The plant survives winter partly because of the snow, not in spite of it. What is striking about cold-adapted plants is the quality of their endurance. Not dramatic endurance, not the visible struggle of motion, but biochemical stillness, a quieting of metabolism, a drawing inward of resources and activity, like a fire banked to coals, holding heat through a long night. Seasons are a rhythm, and these plants have learned, over millions of years, to live inside that rhythm, to be abundant in the brief summer, and patient in the winter, to flourish, and then to wait. We tend to think of plants as passive, as still, silent, unresponsive things that simply grow and wait. But this is a perspective shaped by the limits of our own senses, by the fact that we live too fast to see what plants do, and that much of what they do happens in chemical realms we cannot directly perceive. Plants are not passive. They respond. They communicate. They defend themselves with a sophistication that has been refined, like all things in life, by millions of years of pressure. The most visible plant defenses are physical. Thorns, spines, barbs, the rose with its recurved hooks, the hawthorn with its long, sharp lateral stems, the thistle with its armor of stiff spines on every surface. These structures are straightforward in their function. They make the plant uncomfortable or dangerous to eat. A deer that tries to eat a hawthorn has a bad experience. It may try again, or it may not. Over thousands of generations, plants that happened to produce more pronounced thorns were more likely to be avoided by herbivores, to survive, to reproduce. Those plants passed their thorn-producing genetics to their offspring. But physical defenses are only part of the story. And in many ways, the chemical defenses that plants have evolved are far more intricate. Walk through a forest and crush a leaf. The smell you get, pine resin, citrus, the peppery bite of a tomato leaf, the green sharpness of fresh-cut grass, these are volatile compounds, many of them part of the plant's defensive chemistry. Plants produce an astonishing variety of secondary metabolites, chemical compounds that are not directly involved in the basic processes of growth and photosynthesis, but that serve a huge range of other functions, including defense. Tannins are a class of compounds found in the leaves, bark, and fruits of a huge range of plants. They are bitter, astringent, they make unripe fruit unpalatable, and make leaves taste unpleasant to many herbivores. More importantly, tannins bind to proteins, including the digestive enzymes in the guts of animals, reducing their ability to extract nutrition from the plant tissue. An animal that eats a lot of tannin-rich leaves ends up getting less nutrition from its meal than it should, a kind of metabolic sabotage. Alkaloids are another class of defensive compounds, nitrogen-containing molecules with powerful effects on animal nervous systems. Nicotine in tobacco, caffeine in coffee plants, morphine in poppies, solanine in potato leaves. Each of these compounds has evolved, in its plant of origin, as a deterrent, causing neurological symptoms, nausea, or other ill effects in animals that eat the plant in quantity. We humans have discovered many of these compounds through our own complex relationship with plants, and repurposed some of them as medicines or stimulants. But in their plants, they are weapons. The weapons are not simply preloaded and static either. Many plants respond to attack by increasing their chemical defenses. When a caterpillar begins feeding on a leaf, the plant detects the damage through changes in cell pressure, through the presence of specific enzymes in insect saliva, through other chemical signals, and begins producing more defensive compounds in the damaged tissue and in surrounding leaves. It upregulates its chemical defenses in response to attack. And more remarkable still, it signals to its neighbors. When a plant is attacked by herbivores, it releases volatile compounds into the air, specific blends of chemicals that drift on the wind to nearby plants of the same species. These downwind plants, detecting this signal, begin producing defensive chemicals of their own before they are attacked. They prime themselves for an attack that has not yet reached them. It is not communication in the conscious sense. There is no intention, no message deliberately sent and interpreted. It is chemistry responding to chemistry, signal triggering response. But the functional result is a kind of early warning system, a chemical broadcast that prepares a community for what is coming. Plants also communicate below ground, through the mycorrhizal networks. When a plant under attack releases certain compounds, connected plants in the fungal network may also show altered chemistry, as though the signal has traveled through the shared underground connections. These responses exist because of coevolution, the long, reciprocal evolutionary relationship between plants and the animals that eat them. As herbivores evolved better ways to eat and detoxify plants, developing gut bacteria that break down tannins, for example, or evolving metabolic enzymes that neutralize specific alkaloids, the plants, over generations, evolved new or more potent defenses. The herbivores responded in turn. And the plants again. This back and forth has continued across deep time, driving extraordinary diversity in plant chemistry and in herbivore physiology simultaneously. It is an arms race, but a very slow, very quiet one. No violence, no urgency, no sudden conflict. Just the patient, generational accumulation of chemical complexity on both sides, each lineage testing the limits of the other's tolerance. The result is that even a single acre of forest contains a library of chemical compounds of extraordinary complexity, compounds that pharmaceutical researchers have spent decades trying to catalog, that indigenous traditional knowledge systems have recognized and used for centuries, that most of us walk past without any awareness of their existence. The forest is not quiet in its chemistry. It is busy, complex, active, full of a conversation we cannot directly hear. Flowers arrived relatively late in the story of plant evolution. For most of the history of plants, for hundreds of millions of years, there were no flowers. Ferns reproduced by spores. The early forests of the Carnivorous had no blooms. Conifers and their relatives, which still persist today as pines, spruces, firs, and cedars, use wind to carry pollen between plants, a process that works, but is imprecise, a shotgun approach that requires vast quantities of pollen in the hope that some finds its target. Then, somewhere around 130 to 150 million years ago, in the early Cretaceous period, when dinosaurs still walked the earth, flowering plants appeared. The angiosperms. And within perhaps 20 to 30 million years, they had begun to spread across the continents and diversify into an astonishing variety of forms. Today, flowering plants comprise approximately 90% of all land plant species. They are by far the most successful plant group on Earth, in terms of diversity and abundance. What drove that extraordinary success? In large part, the flower itself. The flower is, at its core, a reproductive structure, an apparatus for bringing pollen from one plant to another of the same species with much more precision than wind alone can achieve. To accomplish this, flowering plants evolved something that changed both themselves and the animals they recruited as partners. They evolved reward. And in doing so, they evolved beauty. A flower's color, its shape, its scent, its nectar, these are all, in evolutionary terms, signals and rewards designed. Without design, through selection, to attract animals who will carry pollen. The bright yellow of a dandelion against green grass catches the eye of a bee in search of food. The deep tubular form of a trumpet flower is precisely the shape needed for the long beak of a hummingbird to fit inside. The ultraviolet patterns that appear on many flowers, invisible to human eyes but vivid to bees, act as nectar guides, landing strips, pointing toward the reward at the center. Each flower-pollinator relationship has been shaped by mutual selection. A flower that was visited more reliably by pollinators reproduced more successfully, and so traits that made it more attractive to pollinators were selected for over generations. A pollinator that could access the nectar of a particular flower more efficiently, because of a particular beak shape, or tongue length, or color vision, had better nutrition and reproduced more successfully, passing those traits on. The two lineages shaped each other, generation by generation, across millions of years. The result is a dazzling co-evolutionary complexity. Orchids have co-evolved with specific pollinators so precisely that some species can only be pollinated by a single insect species. The bucket orchid of Central America produces a slippery liquid in a cup-like structure. Male bees collect this liquid to use in their own courtship displays, and in doing so, brush against the orchid's pollen and carry it to the next flower. The fig and its wasp have one of the most intimate and ancient of all plant-insect partnerships. The fig is in fact an inside-out flower, and the fig wasp enters it, pollinates it, and lays its eggs within it, the two species utterly dependent on each other across millions of years of shared evolution. Scent is a dimension of flowers that our noses can access directly, though imperfectly. We smell a fraction of what insects detect. Many flowers produce scents that mimic the pheromones of female insects, attracting male insects that attempt to mate with the flower and carry off pollen in their confusion. The bee orchids of Europe are perhaps the most famous example. They have evolved petals that look and smell enough like a female bee that male bees attempt to copulate with them. The orchid is, in evolutionary terms, cheating. It offers nothing but a deception, and yet the deception works often enough. After pollination, after pollen has traveled from one flower to another of the same species and fertilized the egg, the plant faces the next challenge. Dispersal. Getting seeds away from the parent plant, out into new territory, away from the competition of siblings and the shade of the parent crown. Fruit is the answer flowering plants evolved. The fruit is essentially a modified ovary wall that develops around the seed or seeds after fertilization, ripening into a structure that is attractive to animals. Animals eat the fruit, the sweet, nutritious flesh, and the seeds, encased in tough coats that resist digestion, pass through the animal's gut and are deposited elsewhere in the landscape, often with a ready supply of fertilizer in the form of the animal's droppings. A bird eating a cherry in a hedgerow and flying 2 kilometers before depositing the seed at the edge of a woodland, that is the seed dispersal partnership in action. The plant has made a bargain. It invests energy in producing sweet, nutritious fruit, and in return, an animal transports its seeds. Both benefit from the interaction. The animal gets food. The plant gets dispersal. And evolution has shaped both parties toward greater and greater efficiency in the exchange. Flowers, then, are not ornaments. They are not gifts. They are extraordinarily precise instruments of reproduction, honed by millions of years of co-evolution with a changing cast of pollinators, each species shaping and being shaped by the other in the long, intricate dance of partnership. Beauty, in this case at least, arose from survival. Inside every seed, there is a possibility held in suspension. A seed is not quite alive, in the way a leaf, or a root, or a growing shoot is alive. Its metabolic activity has slowed almost to nothing, to the minimum required to maintain viability, to keep the blueprint intact. But it is not dead. It is waiting. And the boundary between waiting and beginning is only a matter of the right conditions arriving, the right moisture, the right temperature, the right chemical triggers. The evolution of the seed was one of the pivotal moments in plant history. Before seeds, plants reproduced using spores, tiny, single cells released in enormous numbers to drift on the wind, germinating only if they landed in precisely the right conditions. Spores carry no provision. They have no food reserves. They are minimal, simple, and require a moist, hospitable environment to succeed. The seed is different in kind. A seed contains an embryo, a miniature plant in arrested development, and, surrounding it, a supply of stored food. Starch, oils, proteins, that will fuel the embryo's growth through the critical first phase of germination, before it can produce its own food through photosynthesis. The whole package is enclosed in a tough, protective coat, the seed coat or testa, that resists drying, resists digestion, resists many physical insults, and can maintain the seed in viable condition for periods of time that vary from weeks to centuries, depending on the species. This provision is what gives seeds their extraordinary resilience. A seed that lands in inhospitable conditions does not die immediately. It waits. The embryo inside does not begin to develop until conditions are right. And the definition of right conditions has been refined by evolution to match very specifically the conditions under which that species is likely to survive. Some seeds require a period of cold, weeks or months at near freezing temperatures, before they will germinate. This is called cold stratification, and it prevents seeds from germinating in a warm autumn spell, only to be killed by the returning winter. The cold period tells the seed, winter has passed, spring is here, it is safe to begin. Other seeds require the chemical compounds in smoke to trigger germination, an adaptation in fire-prone landscapes, where the timing of fire signals the opening of a new ecological opportunity in freshly cleared, nutrient-rich soil. Other seeds have their germination inhibited by light, only sprouting when buried, ensuring the embryo is in the soil before it begins to grow, rather than sitting exposed on the surface. Travel is another dimension of seed success. Getting seeds away from the parent plant improves their chances of finding new territory, and avoids crowding with sibling plants, and competition with the parent. The mechanisms plants have evolved for seed dispersal are remarkably varied. Wind dispersal is perhaps the most familiar. The papery wings of maple seeds, spinning as they fall. The feathery plumes of dandelion and thistle seeds, carried on the slightest breeze for distances of kilometers. The tiny, dust-like seeds of orchids, barely visible individually, lifted by air currents and distributed almost randomly across vast areas. Water dispersal carries seeds along rivers and across oceans. The coconut, that large, buoyant, waterproof seed, has crossed open ocean, colonizing tropical islands far from any continental landmass. Many wetland plants produce seeds that float, finding new habitats downstream or across flooded plains. Animals carry seeds in ways beyond the fruit-eating relationship described earlier. Seeds with burrs and hooks, the burdock, the cleavers, the various species of bidens, attach to fur, or feathers, or clothing, and travel with the animal until they are groomed or rubbed off, often in a distant location. Squirrels and jays cache seeds for winter food, burying thousands of acorns and other large seeds that they then often fail to retrieve, effectively planting them across a landscape, sometimes carrying individual seeds hundreds of meters from the parent tree. Some plants disperse their seeds through mechanical means. Explosive pods and capsules that build up tension as they dry, and then suddenly release it, throwing seeds outward with surprising force. The witch hazel shoots seeds several meters. The squirting cucumber propels its seeds through a jet of liquid squeezed from the fruit. The sandbox tree's seed pods, the size of small pumpkins, explode with sufficient force that they are sometimes described as resembling small grenades, seeds sent flying up to 100 meters in all directions. Each of these strategies is an answer to the same evolutionary pressure. Get your offspring away from you, into new territory, ahead of the competition, with enough provision to survive the first precarious weeks of growth. Seeds are the plant's investment in the future. They are the vehicles of inheritance, the means by which genetic information survives across seasons, across droughts, across the long absences of favorable conditions. They are patience made physical, the compressed potential of a living thing, waiting for its moment. And every seed that eventually opens, every tiny root that pushes down into the soil, every first leaf that unfolds and lifts toward light, is a moment of beginning that has been in preparation, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. Time capsules of life, patient as only living things can be. The range of environments where plants grow is, in human terms, almost impossible. We tend to experience the natural world from the mild middle of its range, temperate forests, managed farmland, city parks. But the margins of plant life extend into territories that seem, from the comfortable center, entirely inhospitable. There are plants that eat animals. Carnivorous plants evolved in nutrient-poor environments, peat bogs, sandy soils, tropical outcroppings where rainfall is high but the substrate holds almost no nitrogen or phosphorus. In these habitats, the usual route to nutrients through root uptake is inadequate. The soil simply doesn't contain enough. And so, independently, in multiple separate lineages, plants evolved the capacity to supplement their photosynthetic diet with the nutrients contained in animal tissue, primarily insects, though larger species occasionally capture small vertebrates. The diversity of trapping mechanisms evolved by carnivorous plants is remarkable. The Venus flytrap uses a rapid closure mechanism, a snap trap, triggered by the bending of small trigger hairs on the leaf surface, that closes in a fraction of a second around an insect that has wandered inside. Sundews produce sticky droplets on long tentacle-like hairs. An insect that lands on the leaf becomes mired in the adhesive, and the tentacles slowly bend inward around it. Pitcher plants form deep vessels filled with digestive fluid, attracting insects with nectar around the rim, and then letting them fall in, unable to climb back out of the slippery interior. Bladderworts are aquatic, with tiny bladder-shaped traps that create a partial vacuum inside. When a small organism touches the trigger hairs at the entrance, the trap opens rapidly, and the rush of inward-flowing water sucks the organism inside. None of these organisms evolved their trapping strategies by intention. Each is the product of a lineage in which, generation by generation, slight improvements in the trapping mechanism improved nutrient acquisition in a nitrogen-poor environment, improving growth and reproduction, and so selection favored progressively more elaborate structures. Then there are the plants of salt marshes and mangrove coasts, environments where the soil water contains salt concentrations that would be toxic to most plants, drawing water out of roots by osmosis rather than allowing it in. Mangrove trees have evolved an extraordinary suite of adaptations for survival in this hostile chemistry. Some actively exclude salt at their roots, maintaining a freshwater interior in a saltwater world. Others accumulate salt in their tissues and then excrete it through special glands in their leaves. Their root systems are architecturally spectacular, great buttresses and prop roots and the snorkeling aerial roots called nematophores, that rise from the mud around the tree to access oxygen in a waterlogged, anaerobic substrate. Fire-adapted plants represent another extreme. In fire-prone ecosystems, Mediterranean shrublands, African savannas, Australian eucalyptus forest, fire is not a catastrophe, but a regular feature of the environment. And plants have evolved not just to survive it, but to depend on it. Some Australian and South African plants have evolved serotinous cones or fruits, seed pods that are sealed with a resinous bond, and will not open until exposed to the heat of fire. The fire kills the parent plant, but triggers the simultaneous release of potentially thousands of seeds into a landscape newly cleared of competition and enriched with mineral ash. Other fire-adapted plants store their main growing tissue underground, in large woody root masses called lignotubers, which survive the fire that kills the above-ground parts, and resprout vigorously from the protected tissue within days or weeks. Eucalyptus trees, the dominant trees of Australian forests, are themselves significant contributors to fire through the volatility of the oils in their leaves, creating the conditions for the very fires that their own seeds are adapted to exploit. The tree, in a sense, has co-evolved with fire so deeply that it now both creates and depends on it. And then there are the resurrection plants, perhaps the most extreme of all. These are plants that can survive complete desiccation, losing almost all of the water in their cells, shriveling to a dry, dead-looking husk, and then revive completely when moistened. The Rose of Jericho, technically a desert-adapted fern ally, is perhaps the most famous. It curls into a tight ball when dry, which protects the inner tissues, and can roll with the wind across desert landscapes. When it contacts water, it unfolds and turns green again, a process that can happen within hours. How does a plant survive total desiccation without the ice crystal damage that kills most cells when they dry? The answer involves the accumulation of specific sugars, trehalose and others, that at low water concentrations form a glassy, solid state within cells, suspending the normal chemistry of life in a kind of molecular amber, preserving the structural integrity of the cell until water returns. It is biological suspended animation, and it allows these plants to colonize the driest rock faces, the most episodically arid environments on Earth, to be dormant for years, or decades, and to return to life after each rain. At the extreme edges of what is possible for a plant, we find not the absence of life, but its most astonishing expressions. Solutions to environmental challenges so severe that they seem, from our temperate perspective, to exceed what biology can manage. They do not. They have not. They may never. Zoom out once more. Not to the scale of a leaf or a forest, but to the scale of a planet. There is a conversation happening between the living world of plants and the physical world of the atmosphere. A conversation conducted in carbon dioxide and oxygen and water vapor, carried out across every ocean coast and mountainside and river valley on Earth. And it shapes the climate as much as the climate shapes the plants. The most direct part of this conversation is the carbon cycle. Plants absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere during photosynthesis, fixing that carbon into their tissues, into sugars, into cellulose, into wood. A mature forest contains an enormous amount of carbon stored in this form, in trunks and branches and roots and leaf litter, in soil organic matter built up from centuries of decomposing plant material. The world's forests are among the largest carbon stores on the planet's surface, carbon that would otherwise exist as atmospheric carbon dioxide. When plants photosynthesize, they remove carbon dioxide from the air. When plants burn, or when microorganisms decompose dead plant matter, that carbon returns to the atmosphere. The balance between these fluxes, carbon in and carbon out, is one of the major determinants of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration. And atmospheric carbon dioxide influences global temperature through the greenhouse effect. Across deep time, shifts in plant abundance have reshaped the atmosphere. During the Carboniferous period, vast coal-forming forests drew down enormous quantities of carbon dioxide over tens of millions of years. Some scientists link this prolonged carbon burial to global cooling and glaciation events. The compressed remains of those forests are what we now mine and burn as coal, returning ancient carbon to the sky in centuries rather than geological ages. Forests also shape climate through water. Trees draw immense quantities of water from the soil and release it through transpiration, evaporation through leaf stomata. A large tree can transpire hundreds of liters per day. A mature tropical rainforest can transpire so much water that it contributes substantially to its own rainfall. Moisture rises, condenses, falls again as rain. Remove the forest, and the cycle weakens. Rainfall declines. The land dries. The forest undermines itself by its absence. In the Amazon basin, this feedback loop has operated for millions of years. Forest maintaining moisture, moisture maintaining forest. A dynamic equilibrium, resilient, but not unbreakable. Plants also influence the planet's energy balance through albedo. Dark forests absorb more sunlight than pale grasslands or snow-covered ground. In high latitudes, where snow reflects solar radiation back into space, the presence of dark conifer forests reduces that reflectivity, warming regional climates. Vegetation alters not just carbon and water, but light itself. Then there are peatlands. Waterlogged, acidic, oxygen-poor, dominated by sphagnum mosses and other peat-forming plants. These ecosystems accumulate partially decomposed plant material for thousands of years, building thick deposits of peat. Because decomposition is slow in anaerobic conditions, carbon remains locked away. The world's peatlands store an amount of carbon comparable to that in all global forests combined, despite covering far less area. Plants do not intend any of this. They do not regulate atmospheric chemistry as a conscious act. They simply photosynthesize, transpire, grow, shed leaves, die, decompose. But the aggregate effect of billions upon billions of plants doing these ordinary biological things, across every continent, every biome, every coastline, is planetary in scale. Atmosphere and biosphere are not separate systems. They are interwoven. breath answering breath, carbon moving from sky to leaf to soil and back again, water rising through roots and returning as cloud. The planet breathes because its plants do. For most of the history of plants, the pace of environmental change has been slow. Gradual shifts in climate over thousands and millions of years. The slow movement of continents. The rise and erosion of mountain ranges. Plant evolution has generally had time to keep pace. Populations shifting, adapting, across the generations required for natural selection to work. Then, very recently in geological terms, within the last 10,000 years, and dramatically accelerating in the last 2 centuries, one species began changing the planet's environments at a pace unlike anything before. Agriculture transformed plant evolution in a direct and intentional way. Humans began selecting plants for traits useful to us. Higher yield, larger fruits, reduced bitterness, easier harvesting. A new kind of selection pressure. Different from drought, cold, herbivory. Over thousands of years, this human-directed selection reshaped wild plants into crops so different from their ancestors that many can no longer survive without human care. Modern corn, maize, so radically altered from its wild ancestor, Tia Sinti, that the two barely resemble each other. The seeds of modern maize are tightly enclosed in husks. Without human intervention to strip and plant them, the species would struggle to propagate. This is evolution. Rapid, directed, still based on differential reproduction, but driven by human choice. Genetic modification in the modern sense. The direct insertion of specific genes into a plant's genome is a more recent, more precise extension of this intention. Rather than waiting for mutation and variation, plant geneticists can introduce specific sequences, producing resistance to herbicides, enhanced nutrition, tolerance to disease. The debates surrounding this technology are real, complex, layered. But the biology itself remains continuous with evolution's history. Change in genetic sequence, followed by selection for individuals carrying that change. Habitat alteration, however, has been the most transformative and most damaging human influence on plant life. Forests cleared, wetlands drained, grasslands converted to monoculture, soil covered with asphalt and concrete, habitats fragmented, reduced, connectivity between plant populations severed, gene flow interrupted, species adapted to specific conditions losing the territory they require. And yet, evolution continues. Cities, unexpectedly, have become laboratories of rapid adaptation. Roadside plants evolving shorter stems under frequent mowing. Shifts in seed dispersal where wind corridors are blocked. Changes in flowering time in response to urban heat islands. Natural selection operating in sidewalks and vacant lots. Just as surely as in forests, climate change presents a new complexity. As temperatures rise, as precipitation patterns shift, the climatic envelopes within which species evolved begin to move. Some plants track these shifts, migrating northward or uphill. Others, bound to narrow ecological niches, face the disappearance of the conditions they require. What is unprecedented is not change itself. Earth's history has seen warmth and cold, drought and abundance. What is new is the speed. a process that once unfolded over millions of years, compressed into decades. Not a cause for dramatization, but for clarity. A change in the pace of change. Plants are evolving even now. Populations shifting. Traits adjusting. The conversation between plant and environment continues, as it always has. But the environment is speaking more quickly than before. Somewhere in this century, in a field somewhere, a plant will produce a seed with a small genetic difference, a mutation in a gene that influences drought tolerance, or heat resistance, or the timing of germination in response to changed temperature signals. In that field, in that climate, that tiny difference may matter just enough to make that plant slightly more likely to reproduce than its neighbors. Its offspring will inherit the trait. And gradually, over generations, the population will shift in that direction. This is already happening, invisibly and continuously, in plant populations around the world. Evolution does not wait for our attention. It does not pause for our crises or our conversations. It simply continues, as it always has, in the quiet arithmetic of survival and reproduction. But the future of plant evolution is not simply a story of natural processes continuing undisturbed. It is increasingly a story shaped by human choices about which habitats to protect, which species to preserve, which genetic diversity to maintain, and what kinds of deliberate intervention to undertake. Assisted evolution is one concept that ecologists and conservation biologists are beginning to take seriously, the deliberate movement of plant populations or genetic material toward conditions they will face in a warming future, rather than waiting for natural dispersal and adaptation processes that may be too slow to keep pace. Planting seeds of a species in habitats that are not currently within its range but will likely become suitable as climate changes. Selectively breeding or selecting for heat-tolerant individuals within plant populations, accelerating the adaptation that would otherwise require more generations. Introducing genetic variation from related populations into isolated ones, preventing the evolutionary stagnation that comes with inbreeding. These interventions raise real questions about unintended consequences, about the ethics of deliberately altering natural evolutionary trajectories, about where the line falls between conservation and control. They do not have easy answers, but they emerge from a genuine recognition of the situation that plant evolution has always been shaped by environmental change, and that humans are now part of the environment in a way that requires a response, not only from the plants, but from us. Urban ecosystems will likely become increasingly important sites of plant evolution. Cities are, in many ways, novel environments, hotter than surrounding landscapes due to the urban heat island effect, with altered chemistry, altered light regimes, altered patterns of disturbance and opportunity. Plants colonizing cities are already evolving to meet these conditions, and urban plant communities may become, over time, distinct assemblages of adapted forms. The migration of plant species ranges, the slow geographic shifting of where different species can survive, is already observable in many parts of the world. Tree lines are advancing upslope in mountain ranges. The ranges of many plant species have shifted northward or to higher elevations over recent decades. This will continue, and likely accelerate. In some cases, new ecological communities will assemble, combinations of species from different historical ranges that have never before grown together, creating novel ecosystems without historical precedent. What will these future plant communities look like? It is difficult to say. Evolution has always been unpredictable in its specifics. New traits arise from mutations that occur by chance. The interactions among species, pollinator relationships, root symbioses, herbivore dynamics, will shift in ways that are hard to forecast. The future of plant life on Earth is not written. It is being written, now, continuously, in the language of genetics and environment and time. What we can say with some confidence is that plants will persist. They have survived the mass extinctions that punctuate geological history, including events far more severe than any human disturbance, and they have recolonized the world each time. They will continue to evolve, in whatever conditions arise. Life is, in this sense, stubborn. It fills the available space. It finds the solutions, or perishes trying. The question is not whether plants will survive the future. It is what kind of future we are shaping, and whether the plants that emerge from it will still be the ones we know. There is something in the life of a plant that speaks, quietly, to something we recognize in ourselves, or perhaps something we have forgotten. We live in a world that values speed. The quick response, the immediate solution, the dramatic transformation. We measure success by how fast things change, how rapidly problems are solved, how soon the next development arrives. We are restless, seeking creatures, mobile, reactive, our attention drawn by urgency, our anxiety sharpened by the unending pace of the world we have built. And then there is a tree. A tree that has been growing in the same place for 200 years. That has not moved in those 2 centuries. That has not worried about tomorrow, or mourned yesterday, or made plans for next season. That has simply done what it does, put roots down, reach upward, unfurl leaves in spring, draw inward in autumn, endure the storms, and wake again. There is no wisdom here in the conscious sense. The tree does not contemplate. It does not reflect. And yet, contemplating it, we reflect. We see, in the patient architecture of a long-lived plant, qualities that we might name patience, resilience, rootedness, presence. These are not metaphors projected onto an indifferent object. They are real qualities, real adaptations shaped by real evolutionary pressures that we recognize because they are qualities we too need, in different forms, for our own survival and flourishing. Consider patience. In human life, patience is difficult. We feel the passage of time acutely. We chafe against delays. We want outcomes, quickly. Plants have no such experience of time, but their evolution has created organisms that operate on timescales so much longer than our own, that patience is not a virtue they practice, it is what they are. A seed waiting in the soil for the right conditions is not exercising patience in any conscious sense. But the fact of its waiting, the biological reality that it will not open prematurely, that it will wait through seasons of unfavorable conditions for the moment that is truly right, is a physical embodiment of the kind of timing that is, often, the difference between failure and success. Consider stillness. Plants are still in a way that we are not. They do not flee from threats. They do not chase opportunities. They remain where they are, and in remaining, they become deeply integrated with their place, with its soil chemistry, its light regime, its community of organisms. The stillness of a plant is not passivity. It is deep engagement with the immediate. The mycorrhizal network beneath a forest tree is not a structure built by wandering. It is the product of staying, of remaining in place long enough for the slow elaboration of complex relationships to unfold. We tend to think of resilience as the ability to bounce back, to recover from adversity with vigor and speed. But plants offer a different model of resilience. Not the spring of a compressed object released, but the patient endurance of a cushion plant on a mountain, sitting quietly through decades of storms, barely changing year to year, persisting through conditions that would kill less adapted things simply by being exactly what it is, no more and no less. Consider interconnection. The individual plant is not as individual as it appears. Its root system is threaded through a fungal network connecting it to dozens of other plants. Its leaves are in constant chemical conversation with the atmosphere, and with the insects and other organisms that visit them. Its seeds are carried by animals that feed on its fruits, and those animals are fed by the insects that pollinate its flowers, and those insects are fed by other plants, and so on through a web of relationships so dense and intricate that isolating any single strand and calling it independent is, in a deep sense, false. We, too, are not as individual as we appear. We are embedded in systems of relationship, ecological, social, cultural, biological, that constitute us as much as our individual genetics. The oxygen in our blood was produced by plants. The food that built our bodies was grown from soil amended by the decomposition of uncountable organisms. We breathe, and eat, and exist within systems that we did not create and cannot wholly see, just as the tree in the forest exists within systems that extend far beyond what its own tissues touch. What plants teach, not through any teaching, but through simply being, is that survival over long timescales does not require aggression, or urgency, or the constant transformation of oneself and one's world. It requires adaptation, real, deep, physically embodied adaptation to the actual conditions of the actual place one actually inhabits. It requires integration, becoming so thoroughly woven into a web of relationships that your presence becomes part of the functioning of a larger whole. And it requires a quality that is perhaps best described simply as persistence, the stubborn, quiet, ongoing fact of continuing to be. Plants have been doing this for hundreds of millions of years. They have survived ice ages and mass extinctions and the slow drift of continents and the rise and fall of oxygen concentrations in the air. They have found a way to live in the driest deserts, and the coldest mountains, and the saltiest marshes. They have evolved flowers and fruits and chemical weapons and underground networks and the capacity to wait for years as a seed in dry soil. They have done all of this not through any quality of mind, not through consciousness or intention or planning, but simply through the deep, patient operation of evolution, the blind accumulation of adaptations that happen to work, tested against the reality of an ever-changing world. We watch all of this, sometimes, in gardens, in forests, in the quiet observation of a single leaf catching light. And sometimes, in that watching, something in us is reminded of something we know but have difficulty holding on to in the rush of ordinary life. That change is slow. That good things take time. That the deepest structures of identity, of relationship, of the self in its place, grow quietly, underground, out of sight, and that what appears above the surface, in the fullness of time, reflects everything that was built in the dark. We are part of this system. We always have been. And perhaps there is a further thing that plants, in their silent, structural way, have to offer. A perspective on impermanence. A leaf lives for one season, in most deciduous trees. It unfurls in spring, photosynthesizes through summer, and is released in autumn in a deliberate act of conservation. It was never meant to last forever. It was meant to do its work, and then let go. The tree does not grieve the leaf. It has already prepared the bud that will become next year's leaf, small, tightly sealed, winter hardy, resting beneath the bark, waiting. The loss of the leaf is part of the cycle, not a failure of it. The letting go is built into the design. There is something in this that speaks quietly to the human experience of endings, of seasons, of chapters, of the things we love that pass. Not as consolation exactly, but as perspective. The forest does not resist autumn. It moves into it with a kind of biochemical grace, breaking down and recovering, storing and resting, turning inward toward the long patience of winter. And when spring comes, the unfolding is not a triumph over loss. It is simply the next movement in a rhythm that has no beginning and no end that any single plant can know. Perhaps that is the deepest thing that plants, in their wordless way, embody. Not wisdom, not intention, not any quality of mind, but a way of being in time that is not anxious about it. A way of inhabiting a place that does not need to possess it. A way of growing that does not require knowing where growth leads. And in the sheer, quiet, persistence of a living thing doing what living things do, in every season, across deep time, there is something that quiets the human mind when we let ourselves notice it. Return now to the forest. It is evening. The light is different, golden, warm, coming at a lower angle through the canopy, and touching the undersides of leaves in a way that makes them seem almost luminous. The mist has lifted from the valleys. Somewhere distant, a bird calls once, and then is quiet. The air carries the smell of evening damp, of warming earth releasing the stored coolness of the soil, of leaves and bark and the faint green exhalation of a forest breathing. You have been here before, at the beginning, at the dawn, when we first entered this story. The forest is the same, and you are perhaps different, having walked for a long time through deep history, through the ancient ocean and the first tentative greening of the land, through the chemistry of leaves and the patience of seeds and the invisible networks of roots and fungi, through drought and cold and fire and flower. And now, at dusk, with the day ending and the quiet deepening, there is an opportunity simply to be here, in this moment, and to see. Look at the trees around you. Each one is old in a way that is difficult to feel without the context we have been building. The oak at the edge of the clearing may be 300 years old. The process that made it, that shaped every feature of its bark and root and leaf and acorn, began not 300 years ago, but hundreds of millions of years ago, in the evolutionary lineage from which oaks descended, trial upon trial upon trial, every feature present today the result of some ancient test met and passed. The root system beneath your feet, invisible, is extending right now. Growing. Root tips pushing through the dark soil, sensing gradients, following moisture and nutrients through the medium they have evolved to navigate. Fungal hyphae thread between the mineral particles, connecting tree to tree in a network you could no more see than you could see the air. In the leaves above, the final light of day is still being captured. Electrons are being energized in chloroplasts. Sugars are being moved through phloem. Stomata are beginning to close for the night, conserving the water that will be needed for tomorrow's photosynthesis. The leaf is already preparing for morning, though morning is hours away. Seeds are falling. Tiny and quiet, they descend through still air, and land on the forest floor, each one a compressed beginning, a patient possibility, waiting for the conditions that will open it. Somewhere in this forest, at this moment, a plant is being eaten. Somewhere a chemical signal is drifting through the air. Somewhere underground, a fine root tip is encountering a new region of soil, feeling its way through the dark. Somewhere in the heartwood of a very old tree, the lignin laid down in rings 300 years ago holds the tree upright, the record of 3 centuries of growth encoded in the chemistry of wood. And somewhere in the genome of a seed, somewhere in the long molecule of DNA coiled within one of its cells, a mutation has occurred, or will occur, that may mean nothing, or may become the first step toward an adaptation that does not yet have a name, that will not be visible for 10,000 years, that will be recognized as significant only in retrospect, by eyes that do not yet exist. Evolution is happening now, in this forest, as it always has. It does not announce itself. It does not pause to be observed. It simply continues, slowly, continuously, with infinite patience, shaped by the interaction of living things with the conditions that surround them. Plants have been the quiet architects of this world longer than almost anything else. They built the soil. They cleaned the air. They generated the oxygen that made complex animal life possible. They created the habitats in which every terrestrial ecosystem is embedded. They shaped the water cycle and the carbon cycle and the chemical composition of the atmosphere. And they did all of this not through intelligence or purpose or will, but through the patient accumulation of adaptations, through hundreds of millions of years of the simplest possible process, living, and then living again, a little differently, a little better fitted to the world as it was. They have seen continents form and break apart. They have survived asteroids and ice ages. They have colonized lava fields and salt flats and the windswept tops of mountains and the spray zone of ocean cliffs. They have formed partnerships with fungi and insects and birds and mammals. They have evolved thorns and toxins and flowers of breathtaking intricacy and seeds that survive 2,000 years. And they have done all of this in stillness, without urgency, without movement, by becoming, over deep time, exactly what each particular place required them to be. Plants do not rush. They do not wander. And yet they have conquered the land, every habitable surface on every continent, with a quiet thoroughness that no animal has matched. For hundreds of millions of years, they have shaped this world, silently and without knowing it, transformed an inhospitable rock into a living planet, built the conditions for nearly all complex life that followed. And tonight, as the forest settles into its evening quiet, as the light fades from the undersides of the high canopy leaves and the first cool of night begins to descend, and as you rest, as you let the day go, and the body ease, and the mind soften into the quiet that follows a long journey, they continue. A root tip pressing through the dark soil. A stomata closing gently as the light drops. A seed waiting in the cold earth for a spring that is still months away. An ancient tree standing, as it has stood for centuries, in the deepening dark. Evolution, invisible and patient, writing the next line in a story that will not be finished in any lifetime we can imagine. And the forest breathes. And the forest waits. And the forest continues. Slowly, patiently, under the same sky.